By the favor of the gods, may I, unharmed, be teller of the things that I have heard and what is wrapped in the darkness here below.
From Brandeis University, welcome to Recall This Book. Right now being recorded in Lexington, Massachusetts. It's my very great pleasure to introduce you to a conversation with two poets, the poet David Ferry and the poet Roger Reeves. David Ferry, who is a relation of mine, I'll start out by saying, is the Sophie Chantal Hart Emeritus Professor at Wellesley College. He is translator of numerous things, including the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Odes of Horace, the Epistles and Georgics of Virgil, and Virgil's Aeneid, as well as several of his own books, including Bewilderment, which won the National Book Award for Poetry in 2012. Roger Reeves earned his PhD from the University of Texas at Austin, where he's currently a professor, and he's the author of King Me by Copper Canyon Press from 2013, winner of the Larry Levis Reading Prize, the Penn Oakland Josephine Miles Literary Award, and numerous other awards. His second book collection of poetry is forthcoming. Roger, forthcoming or already arrived?
March 2022.
All right, we'll be in the world as of March 2022 from W.W. Norton. So this episode really comes out of a series of conversations that these two poets have been having, and that I've had the good fortune to have with them on the topic of the underworld and the underworld in their poetry. So what we'd like to do today is hear from their poetry, and then a little bit about some of the lines, some of the presences of underworlds within the poems themselves, and we'll see where that takes us. Okay, so without further ado, we're going to start with David Ferry, and he's going to read a selection from Book 6 of the Aeneid.
Thanks, Elizabeth. And hi, Roger.
Hey, David.
I want to start with a passage from Aeneid's, from Virgil's Aeneid, and it's a passage where Aeneas is entering the underworld, seeking the shade of his father Anchises in order to have Anchises tell him what is going to happen in the adventure and mission of founding a Rome to replace the Troy that they've lost. And he's entering the underworld with his Sibyl, and he's scared to death about what's going to happen. And I think that fright is in all the missions of what I'm just going to read. You gods who rule the kingdoms of the spirits, you tongueless shades, you Phlegethon and chaos, you silent spreading regions of the dark, by the favor of the gods, may I, unharmed, be teller of the things that I have heard and what is wrapped in the darkness here below. This is the verse is iambic pentameter with many anapestic variations, but in the lonely gloom of the night, two figures walk through the empty rooms of Dis's empty kingdom, as if upon a path beneath the uncertain, meager light of moon, almost not there, at a time when Jupiter has hidden the sky in darkness and black night has taken away from all things all the colors that they had. Just at the innermost end of the entrance court, just at the place where Orcus's jaws are open, there's grief. There's unrelenting cares. Birds have placed their beds. There's ashen-faced disease, sad age. There's fear. There's hunger, begetter of crime. There's death and his brother's sleep and guilty desires. And on the other side of the open door, there's war, dealer of death. And they're in the cells of the Furies and insane discord with bloody ribbons in her snaky hair. In the midst, there is an enormous, shadowy plane tree spreading its arms and false dreams clinging under every single leaf of its foliage, so men say. And also many forms of monstrous creatures, centaurs staring at the threshold there, and biform Scyllas and Briareus, hundred-handed, 50-headed, and the striding, hissing beast of Lerna, and the chimera breathing fire, and harpies, and he, the three-bodied shade. Aeneas, trembling, terrified at the sight, unsheathes his sword and turns its edge against them, and he would, had not his sage companion told him that these were bodiless, empty images of life, have slashed at the fleeing shadows which he saw. In a way, it's like, in these lines, like a description of just nighttime. Jupiter hides it, and for us at nighttime, the underworld itself seeps into our dreams, and it's there. He's descending into hell, yes, literally and rightly, but also he's descending in the way at nighttime comes, and he encounters the whole conditions of vulnerable human life, sad age, grief, cares, hunger, destitution, the failures of individuals and of societies, and so on. And as I hear it in the lines, there's grief. And then it's as if they're looking another place. There's unrelenting cares, where they have placed their beds. There's ashen-faced disease. With each there, it's them experiencing yet another image, and so on. To Virgil's opportunity to talk about Aeneas's knowledge that the culture that he's trying to replace with the culture of Rome, the culture that fallen Troy had, was a place full of cares, full of death, full of age, full of desires, and Rome is going to be like that too. It makes the desire to found the great culture of Rome know about itself already and its vulnerability.
It's so interesting because when I hear this particular moment in section 6, I can't help but think about how the lyric tradition comes out of this moment. This sort of moment with that deictic there, that sort of deicticness. I'm thinking about Jonathan Culler's sort of theory of the lyric, right? And other things I've read about how sort of the epic, there are moments that we can think about the lyric tradition, right? Because the epic was the real, that was the like legit poetry, right? That was the real, and the lyric was kind of like this bastard, like, you know, to the side form that wasn't really a form yet. But it's so, to me, there's this moment where that listing that occurs, that cataloging, sounds, that cataloging feels for me to be quite, it sort of feels like a departure, a sort of, even though it's describing what they're seeing, it sort of takes over, and almost itself becomes.
You mean the cataloging of grief and hunger and
disease? It almost overwhelms.
Yeah.
The poem. It becomes this thing, right? It's a list. It's part of, you know, what they're seeing, but it also has this sort of something else is occurring. The type of singing of that type of grief that to me feels very lyric. Feels like, oh, this is the harbinger to the lyric, and to the possibility of like the lyric utterance.
Well, the there's grief and there's this, it's very theatrical, right? It's kind of like setting the stage.
Well, it reminds me of Dante in that moment in the Inferno. And I think like I see this from, it's funny because I see it in Dante, I see it in Virgil, and I even see it in hip hop, which is this moment where the speaker, the poet, right, is like, okay, I'm a poet, I'm letting y'all know, and I've been called to do this great thing. I've been called to reveal, right? And like I think about when Dante is like, he sees the poets, the dead poets, and they're like, come up, you are one like us, come over here. And he's like, oh, I'm a great poet, right? Like he, in that moment, sort of puts himself in the realm of the great poets. So there's a way in which, to me, it's like in hip hop when rappers will be like, I'm the best, da da da, right? It's you know?
I think that genealogy, Roger, you're tracing is great though, of the kind of, you know, now, you know, it's almost like I've got the mic now, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. So Dad, would you like to now read Resemblance?
Sure. This is a poem of mine from my book, Bewilderment. Wait a minute. Oh, the poem is called Resemblance, and it comes from a really uncanny experience I had. My family, my father's family, had a burial plot in a cemetery in West Orange, New Jersey. I grew up in Maplewood nearby. And I went down after the death of my parents to take their ashes down to this graveyard and give them an honorable burial there. And then I badly needed to go get lunch and get a drink and recover from that sad experience. And I went into a restaurant nearby in Central Avenue, and there, I swear to God, there, sitting at a table with some other figures, was what looked identically like my father. And he was sitting with some other people. And so that's people remark on this, you know, kind of experience of resemblance, especially when you're thinking of your dead beloveds or your dead relatives, and so on. It was my father in that restaurant on Central Avenue in Orange, New Jersey, where I stopped for lunch and a dinner after coming away from visiting, after many years had passed, the place to which I brought my father's ashes and the ashes of my mother, and where my father's grandparents, parents, brothers had been buried, and others of the family all together. The atmosphere was smoky, and there was a vague, struggling transaction going on between the bright daylight of the busy street outside and the somewhat dirty light of the unwashed ceiling globes of the restaurant I was in. He was having lunch. I couldn't see what he was having, but he seemed to be eating, maybe without noticing whatever it was he may have been eating. He seemed to be listening to a conversation with 2 or 3 others, shades of the dead, come back from where they were to where they went away, or maybe those others weren't speaking at all. Maybe it was a dumb show put on for my benefit. It was the eerie persistence of his not seeming to notice that I was there while watching him from my table across the room. It was also the sense of his being included in the conversation around him, and yet not. Though this in life had been familiar to me, no great change from what had been true before, even in my sense that I, across the room, was excluded, which went along with my sense of him when he was alive, that he often didn't feel included in the scene and talk around him, and his isolation itself excluded others. When where were we in that restaurant that day? Had I gone down into the world of the dead? Were those other people really shades of the dead? We expect that if they came back, they would come back to impart some knowledge of what it was they had learned, or if this was included down there, then they down there would reveal to us who visit them in a purified language some truth in our condition of being alive. We are unable to know. Their tongues are ashes when they'd speak to us. Unable to know is a condition I've lived with all my life. Poverty of imagination about the lives of another human being. This is, I think, the case with everyone. Is it because there's a silence that we are, all of us, forbidden to cross? Not only the silence that divides the dead from the living, but antecedent to that is that the silence there is between the living and the living, unable to reach across that silence through the baffling light there always is between us. Among the living, the body can do so sometimes, but the mind, constricted, inhibited by ancestral knowledge of the final separation, holds back, unable to complete what it wanted to say. What is your name that I can call you by? Virgil said when Eurydice died again, there was still so much to say that had not been said even before her first death, from which he had vainly attempted with his singing to rescue her. And that's part of what in the other passage, I think from the Aeneid, that he goes down into the underworld to find out what it's like down there, and it's not a special instance in a sense that he finds the conditions of our culture, sad age, fear, war, wasting away, and so on. And implicit also the great accomplishments of the culture he's endeavoring to preserve. in the Aeneid and going to Rome.
And there's a corollary in your poem in that same way, in that you have the dead come back and you say, we expect that if they came back, they would come back to impart some knowledge of what it was they had learned, right? But they're just eating. And I find this such a great defamiliarization of the way we think of the dead entering in the poem. They're just eating. They're just like doing some regular, like banal, and they don't do that. And so it's such a, in some ways they are telling us something, right? In that moment.
Yes, they may be, but it may just be. There we are. We are what we used to be. And the line that in some ways I find central to the poem is, their tongues are ashes when they speak to us, and so on. And that in a way goes back to another poem I translated, a poem of Catullus, when he went to visit the grave of his brother in Asia Minor, and he says, seeking to speak to ashes that cannot speak.
It's also interesting to trace the tongues from the first poem, right? Because the shades were tongueless in the first poem, right? The gods, right? But these, the dead here, the departed here, they do have to, but their tongues are ashes. So it's this, like, we're always in the state of moving towards sort of an absented tongue, an absented speech. And so, like, it's so interesting because I was like mapping the tongues and mapping sort of what's happening in terms of speech, and it's only really the living that speak in that way.
And that actually connects to, I mean, I can't figure out why I find the words Virgil said so important. But I think, especially when it's, Virgil said, there was still so much to say, right? So Virgil said that the things could not be said. But I think maybe it gets at this question of, you talked, Dad, about our culture, our human culture, and it's kind of, you may find this too strong, but it's sort of inadequacy, and yet it's kind of maybe heroism, or just sort of the saying, the poetry as to kind of doing this, planting this little flag, or doing what it can against this inadequacy, or to kind of mark this inadequacy.
Virgil said, and the great moment in the poem is because he dared to go down to the underworld, and what he found down there was us, with our limitations. And it's not just Virgil said this, but the prior poet, the father of all poets in some way, Orpheus, and Eurydice.
Yeah, that makes me want to read this poem that I sent to you for today. I feel like I feel like I should read this poem right now.
Yeah.
And in this poem, I'm imagining two sort of mythological worlds: the world of Grendel and Beowulf, and the world of Orpheus and Eurydice as well.
And the world
of Orpheus and Eurydice, that they're like living, like there's this like sort of space in which they're all together. So this is called Grendel's mother. It was not like the woman who had come out of hell, haired and furred in black earth, smelling of fire. Her lover, green and brown in the green and brown field, his back a torn limb broken from the tree of her, ripped, the gesture of his uneven walking, his refusal to turn to her who called to him, mouthing the or of his name, as if she were giving his waiting away from her through the tall grass, a counter, offer, argument, me, turn to me, to us, and in that leaving gesture of a ripped limb, he turned to her, to us, and even the ram who drove his skull into the rocks stopped his thinking and watched the woman yanked back down into the earth's black holler and soil, and so was outside of thinking, so furious I was when my son called me out of heaven to the crag and corner store where it was that he was dying. Mama, I can't breathe. Even now, I hear it, the limb of him broken in the black beast bird's morning call that pins the heaven to the black road. I can't breathe, and the waters curve and slur over the narrow paths in the trail and gutter his body made in the mud where the sky barges in and fills. It was not like the woman who had come out of hell, Orpheus, unable to touch her. I touched my son in his dying, where he was crushed, carn, blood belt of the dying earth, and without song other than my feet shuffling in the dead leaves, which is not the song I wanted to give to his dying, to his dark and darkening ear. The day opening, sun warming stone and the musk of it, where the river flowers bleed their yellow scent on the water, ever, even ever, in its any and always, in its absence of meekness, which is to say, God, I wanted for him a hunger outside of heaven.
Oh, God. That's so beautiful. It's so beautiful. And of course, it's partly because of it's memorializing a terrible event that it's talking about, and it's without any self pride, in a sense that so often poems that memorialize great events that in some way or other the culture is trying to learn to be sharing in some way or other.
Yeah.
So on, but that ending of the poem, that ceremonious ending of the poem is so earned by it that thank you.
Yeah, I was thinking, I've been really thinking about Grendel a lot,
Yes.
and Beowulf, partly because I read, Toni Morrison has a great essay on how evil has a mother but never has a father. And I kept thinking about, obviously George Floyd, and for some reason I just feel, and I'll say, I just think that Grendel was probably an African, right? Like, I think Grendel and his mother were probably Africans that lived in like Scandinavia on the outside of some village in real life. And this is how they were remembered. And there's a way in which Grendel's mother is my mother, is I think that she is the like Black mother. And she doesn't get to speak, right? And I was thinking about George Floyd calling his mother from heaven down to her, like, to me, it's all the afterlife. And I think, like, that last line is really wild, because that last line is like, of course a mother would want everything, any types of hunger, but not the hunger of heaven, which is the hunger of death, right? Like, I want my child to have everything but that, right? And like, we always think of heaven as a like solace but like, I'm sure mothers want their children to live, you know? And I just think of Grendel's mother as like, yeah, I think of her a lot. I think of my mother a lot.
Because you have another poem about Grendel that also it seemed to be about what you're saying about this kind of, you know, that Grendel is called to the hall of the, I won't have the language right, but that he's called to the hall where these great songs, heroic songs and epics, and he's kind of called, and he has to be the monster.
Yes.
And he can't, there's no way that he can be in the story without being. And when I was hearing that last line, I wondered whether, you know, that she doesn't want heaven because heaven is the heaven of these song cycles.
Yep.
That are, you know.
One of the things that our conversations have taught me, David, is how ancient our struggles are, right? And like our hungers, our desires they're in every epic. They're in every, you know, and it's, and there's a way in which, for me, you helped me in our conversations touch that part of me that I think is hard to touch in our current moment, partly because I feel like we're in such a solipsistic era that we're not like like when Trump was elected, the thing that I did was I turned back actually to people like Manning Marable and W.E.B. Du Bois, and I started reading Gilgamesh again, because particularly during the pandemic, because I felt like that sort of Gilgamesh's inability to deal with Enkidu's death and how much that grief was just so overwhelming was what I was feeling. And I know what Americans were feeling during COVID, right? Like these deaths are overwhelming. And it was only when I would read, and I would read it every morning for that first month of the pandemic. I just kept reading Gilgamesh in your translation, because there was a way in which Gilgamesh was me, right? Like he's just overwhelmed. So one of the things that I think your poems do so well is they're simultaneously like present and contemporary, and then they're also ancient, right? They're being both. They're in joint with the time and out of joint with it.
Yeah. Yeah, and sort of it's like ancient, but also right there.
This conversation is also making me think of your Arthur Gold poems, those conversations that are happening in the Arthur Gold poems in Bewilderment. Particularly, it's the one, I think it's called, which one? It's Arthur Gold, Rome, December 1973. And actually, it's funny is I was reading that last night in preparation for our discussion, and it sent me into like a little poem. It sent me into thinking about repetition and all the different ways that repetition is participating in departure and arrival. And so I wonder if you might talk a little bit about that, because I wrote something I might share with you. I'm not sure. I don't, it's so new and fresh. The paint is super wet on it. So, but I thought I wrote it thinking about our conversation today, and your work and your sort of work in that, because that also is in the Underworld.
The ways that those figures, his wife, mother, her mother, her aunt, whatever, are like three fates in a sense, and that when they get on the bus and they don't know what
going to happen, and they don't know yet. Arthur had a baby, had a daughter, a wonderful person who was 8 years old when he died.
Mm.
He was only 53 years old. Um,
Hmm.
but he sees the children outside the bus lights, and it's as if they're in the lights of the bus. They can see them, and it's as if they were having a party full of balloons and lights and so on,
Mhm.
like a celebration of that. A celebration of simple celebration of life in a sense, but that isn't taking place that way. It's their own fate, and so that when that heaven sent bus driver,
Mm.
and they're stepping out to the darkness in some place where they don't know where they were going, but they step out, and he says the only thing that's necessary is say coraggio.
Mm-hmm. Yep. I'll read I'll read my wet paint. I'm not quite sure what the title will be. It might be the first line. And it borrows heavily from the Arthur Gold poem I was just referring to, and as well as from the Aeneid, book 6. It's playing in that register. A forgotten destination, not yet known. Death. Or was it fate? Something in me wants to say it. Say it again. Death, a forgotten destination, not yet known. Not yet known. Forgotten. Death. What am I returning to momentarily? The teeth of the sea. The teeth of, you wouldn't understand that after death, my father's death, my shoulders through the air, my ears in the loud, precious winter light, my mind gathered in the crisis of whispering to itself, death, a forgotten destination, not yet known. All my handling at the shoulder, at the ear, the mind, done at the edge of teeth. All handling after death is done at the edge of teeth. The locust undoing the earth to yell from the trees, and the rain, and the smoke, and have not charity or light, willing to light the windows, or my father, the child begging to be born. This, the mystery, the dead mumble over and over to us in our sleep, in our lovemaking, in the hotel room beneath the lamplight. This is not over, our death. Make it here.
I wish I had that poem to put beside Arthur's poem. Thank you so much.
Thank you, David. David, your work is just, I told my partner that I could respond to your poems for a lifetime. I could respond to you. I could spend the rest of my life just reading your poems and responding to and just thinking alongside you. It's one of those things I would have never imagined that I would find a friend like you and like your poems would open the world to me and open me to my own poems. Thank you for thinking of me without knowing you were thinking.
So mutual what you're saying. Oh gosh. Think of that word destination. You know, like a bus's destination. Where is it going? And so on, but it's such a big word.
Mm-hmm. Also, I realized that maybe the thing is that the dead aren't asking us to think about destination as much as they're asking us to think that it's not over. Like I was thinking about how like my father, that death may be the sign of the needing to be born, that spirit needs to be born again, right? So it's like the death is the future, right? The death is calling to the future, right? As opposed to it like stopping the present. That's why I say, or my father, the child begging to be born. Maybe his death is him begging to be born, right? Like, what happens if that is the actual thing, that's actually what death is. And so that's why it's a celebration, right? I think about in the Black church I grew up in, it was supposed to be a celebration, but it was a celebration because you were going to go to heaven. But what if it's actually a celebration because it's actually allowing for this other thing to occur that is just as big, just it's this, yeah, I don't know. I've just been thinking about that. Like, I think because my father died right as my first child was born, and it just seemed like such an interesting moment, an exchange. Yeah, I don't know, just thinking. But you make me think these things. I have these thoughts because of your poems. It's just one of those things where it's a door. Your poems are such great doors, and they open and allow people so much possibility because you offer up like, we can do all of this in a poem. Like everything, like I love the Arthur Gold poems because they're literary criticism with line break, and that takes it back to the idea that everything can happen in poetic verse. There's nothing that sits outside the poem.
God bless. This is great.
Well, I just want to thank you both for being here today and for having this conversation and letting me have it with you and listen to your words.
Thank you. Thank you so much, David. Thank you, Elizabeth.
Recall This Book is the brainchild of John Plotz and Elizabeth Ferry and is affiliated with Public Books. Our music comes from a song by Eric Chaslow and Barbara Cassidy, Fly Away. Sound editing is by Claire Ogden. This is Claire's valedictory episode because she is graduating from Brandeis University, and we thank her for her skill and her vision and wish her the very best. Production assistance, including website design and social media, is done by Nai Kim. Mark DeLello oversees on all technological matters, and we appreciate the support of University Librarian Matthew Sheehy and Dean Dorothy Hodgson, and of the Mandel Center for the Humanities at Brandeis. We always want to hear from you with your comments, criticisms, or suggestions for future episodes. You can email us directly or contact us via social media and our website. And if you enjoyed today's show, please be sure to write a review or to rate us on iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever else you get your podcasts. You may be interested in checking out past episodes, such as David Cunningham on asymmetrical policing in the United States and Lisa Dillman on translation. And shortly, we will be launching a series of short episodes related to John Plotz's new edited volume, B-Sides, Essays on Forgotten Favorites. Thank you for joining us today, and we'll see you next time.